Welcome to Coaching Uncaged by Animas, the podcast that explores the art, science, and career of coaching. And now, introducing your host and interviewer, Yannick Jacob.
Right, Mick Cooper, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Yannick.
I've been waiting for this conversation for some time. I remember you giving a lecture at UEL, University of East London, when I think I was already teaching, but it felt like I was a student. And I was really appreciative of your work around different existential lenses onto therapy. And so you've definitely piqued my interest then. And every touch point I've had when I just kind of read something of you or just seeing you in conversation with, I remember Pnini Trusometsa at a meeting conference in London, just the vibe that you exude and the inspiration that I got from it and that people seem to get from you just made me really excited to dive into a little bit of depth at least.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
So, I mean, you've done a lot in your work. You're an international recognized authority in the field of counseling and psychotherapy. You've authored a number of books. You've developed the pluralistic approach, which is mainly what we want to talk about today with your colleague, Professor John McLeod. And you're a professor at University of Roehampton. So there's the Center of Research for Psychological Wellbeing. So there's a touch point with my kind of positive psychology roots. So there's so many touch points, and I think coaches can learn so much from you. And
I hope so.
I noticed also you're quite active on social media as well, which is hopefully something maybe we have time for. People in general, not just coaches, psychotherapists, counselors, seem to take a lot of inspiration. So that's where I'm at. Is there anything by means of introduction that you would add so people can get a better sense for where you're speaking from?
You know, it's funny, whenever anybody says to me, oh, you've done all these things, I always think, I wish somebody had told my kids that.
Internationally recognized authority, except for your kids.
Until it comes to my kids, and then I'm just dad, and I don't do anything right at all. So, yeah, no, that's very nice of you to say. No, I think that's a good introduction. And I mean, my work most recently has been about social change and the interface between social change and therapy. But I'm really interested. I'm not a coach, but I'm really interested in coaching. I think it's fantastically important work. And I think it has a lot of overlaps with therapy, and differences, which we'll be talking about, I'm sure, in relation to pluralism.
Yeah, and that's definitely something we should mention. You're not a coach. I think the pluralistic approach to therapy, as you seem to practice it, has a lot of parallels with coaching.
Yeah, and there's people who've written about that. People like Sophia Anauchi and Stephen Palmer. We've been doing some writing about pluralistic approach to coaching, so it certainly has applications.
Yeah, and exactly, and that's a really good article to refer coaches to off the bat. 2015, exactly, and we'll share that. It's publicly available. And also Sophia and you guys put that in a book chapter. I saw that came out much more recently, 2 years ago.
Yep.
So there's a lot there that we can talk about. So let's jump into it. Coaching, it was asking for a paradigm shift, right? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why the pluralistic lens is so prevalent and perhaps needed, why the coaching industry seems to have called for something like a pluralistic approach because of that paradigm shift. And I remember the article talked about in the context of digi-modernism, concept developed by Gergen. But could you talk a little bit about what that is about and why such a paradigm shift is needed and how pluralism fits into that?
Yeah, I mean, pluralism really, as we articulated it, emerged in the therapy world. And maybe I'll talk about that first, and we can talk about some of the parallels. So I think in the therapy world, there has been a number of different schools. There's obviously psychoanalytic school and the Jungian school and the Freudian school and Adlerian and then the person-centered and CBT. And while we felt there's an enormous value in all these different schools, there's always a risk that you get caught up in kind of ideological wars and schoolism and a kind of the allegiance to particular doctrines and ideologies kind of takes precedence over what's helpful for clients. So we wanted to, in the therapy world, and maybe this is very relevant for coaching as well, kind of strip that back and start from a position of trying to be really open to all the different truths that are out there. I mean, certainly we know in the therapy world, and I think this is also true for coaching, there's enormous amount of different ways of helping people. There's not one right answer. People don't struggle with problems for one set of reasons, whether it's depression, whether it's not being able to progress with their work, whether it's not knowing what they want in life. There's lots and lots and lots of different reasons. It's very tempting to say this is the one reason, this is what it's about. But actually, the real world is a messy, complex, pluralistic place. And although that's not always the most satisfying answer, it is the truest answer. And I think by being the truest answer, it's the one that's going to be most helpful ultimately for people. So pluralism is a kind of appreciation that there's multiple answers to questions. It's not just there in therapy. I mean, the concept of pluralism stretches into religious thinking, into politics, into areas we'll talk about like coaching. And in all these different places, what it means is rather than saying I'm right, you're wrong, it's about the kind of and or position that, both and position that I can be right and you can be right and somebody else can be right as well. And that kind of move away from modernism, where there's one answer to things, to a more kind of postmodern position. Not that everything's right, not that it doesn't matter, not that we should just give up because there's no truth anywhere, but that there can be multiple truths and multiple perspectives and multiple ways of seeing things. And also very much that different answers can be right for different people. So something that might work for me in therapy, for instance, exploring my past, might be really, really useful, but that doesn't mean that for the next person or for the client I see, that's going to necessarily be the most helpful thing for them. They might want to explore their present, or they might want to explore their future. And it's useful for me to recognize what's helpful for me, but also to be open that for different people, for yourself, for people listening, that there might be lots of different things. So pluralism really is that kind of, it's a spirit of openness, it's a spirit of curiosity, it's a spirit of adventure. I mean, I think that when you're talking, Yannick, about a paradigm shift, certainly within the therapy field, as I'm sure within the coaching field, maybe even more in the coaching, I'm sure a lot of people would already very much appreciate that kind of pluralistic mentality, our way of seeing things. And it probably fits. We certainly found in the therapy world, it kind of fits with how a lot of people see things already, that they kind of recognize that there are different answers, that different people need different things, and that they... sometimes the most helpful approach is to combine different ideas from different places. So I don't think it's a kind of radical new idea, but it's trying to put a label and a terminology and a framework around a way of thinking and seeing the world that a lot of us already have, so that when we're working as a coach, we're not thinking what's going to be what is the right way here, but we kind of appreciate that we're going to do our best, that we have some ideas. And also very importantly in pluralism is the idea that it's not just the practitioner, the therapist or the coach who has all the answers, that the best approaches, most helpful approaches come through a dialogue between us and the people that we work with. And we put a lot of work in the therapy field to looking at things like client preferences, how we work with client preferences. So we have a kind of pluralism. We talk about different pillars, and we have a kind of pluralism across different worldviews. We have a pluralism across different clients and them needing different things. And we have a pluralism across the therapy client or the coach and coachee dyad, recognizing that from all these different angles, that there can be different ideas, different possibilities, and bringing that all together and being open to all of that generally can be the best way towards finding something that really works for the people we're working with.
Yeah. Wow, there was a lot there.
Sorry, that's a lot there. That's a lot. We'll unpack it now.
I was tempted to jump in a bunch of times, but I thought let's just lay this out.
Let's lay it out and then we can jump in.
Exactly. So before we go more on its application in coaching and therapy, I want to just go back to the kind of philosophical basis of it.
Yeah.
Because postmodernism is an interesting one that this has developed out of. And you mentioned this, multiple things can be right at the same time. And oh boy, do we need that as a people. And I think there's a very strong nod to your latest book on psychology for social change, which I'm sure is very much informed by a pluralistic lens. But what would you say to people who'd critique it as well? It's not just that everything is right and anything can be whatever we want it to be. Some things are right and wrong. And in coaching and therapy, it's very difficult to say, this is the right way to coach. This is the right way to practice. It depends on so many different factors. Could you talk a little bit more about
That's a great question and a great point, Janet. And one of the key distinctions in the pluralistic field philosophically is between what's called foundational pluralism and normative pluralism. So foundational pluralism is this kind of pluralism that goes all the way down. It's more like relativism. It's more like the idea that there aren't any truths at all and that everything is ultimately relative, and that pluralism, the world, there's no foundations. Now, the kind of pluralism that we've developed is what you would call a normative pluralism. And sometimes that gets confused, and sometimes people think pluralism just means anything goes. But a normative pluralism is a pluralism for a reason. And that reason is ethics. It's about fundamentally treating people well and with respect. So when we say, does pluralism mean you can, be nasty to people or abuse people? Absolutely not, because it's based on an ethical foundation. It comes out of an ethical foundation that if I'm working as a therapist or I'm working with a coach, I want to engage with that person in a deeply respectful way, a way that respects their humanity, a humanizing way, a way that is foundational to humanistic thinking and existential thinking, all these ideas that have challenged the kind of creeping dehumanization of people in our world. So there is a right and wrong, absolutely, as you say. The right is to try and treat people with respect, and out of that comes a pluralism and a willingness to respect and value different opinions, different views. In Britain at the moment, we've seen riots from the far right. Pluralism doesn't mean just saying, oh, well, that's all right. Everybody's entitled to be, kind of racist or homophobic because that's just their view. The challenge in pluralism is about, and that normative ethical pluralism is about, how do you hold open that space for otherness? And holding open a space for otherness, holding open a space for difference, diversity, holding open that space for people to flourish and to thrive, sometimes means saying no to people. And sometimes it means shutting down in the most humanizing, respectful ways possible. But ultimately, sometimes shutting down those voices if they're trying to silence, oppress others. So there is a right and wrong. And I think, philosophically, I've been very influenced by the work of Martin Buber, and then Emmanuel Levinas, who I think is such an important philosopher. His work is all about the other and about that idea of openness to otherness and that principle of that real challenge, and it is an absolute challenge, to allow ourselves to really hear, engage, be with, have a receptivity to the other. Their kind of diversity, and that sounds a lot easier than it is. That's a real toughness.
And sorry, I want to jump in there because Buber's our relationship that we want to relate to people not as coach-client or therapist-client. We want to relate to someone else as a fellow human being. We meet each other at eye level, and I want to read two quotes from the very short quotes from the article, which I think fit super well here, because when we acknowledge that this is coming from therapy, traditionally the therapist knew best, right? The therapist was applying the process and they had the knowledge and they would share or create a treatment plan. And then over the years, over the decades, lots of therapy approaches developed that were working more on partnership. And coaching generally is, coaches would say, yes, absolutely. I work in partnership and I meet people at eye level and we collaborate. The two quotes go, while all coaches say that they collaborate or work in partnership with their clients or coaches, and there is a feedback culture in these sessions, there's little evidence that they really have one. And the other one goes, coaches found the idea of collaboration inspiring, but struggle to practice in a truly collaborative manner. Now, I hear that a lot in supervision, is that coaches believe that the client is resourceful, creative, and whole, and that they know what they need. But then when they actually talk about how they relate and how they practice with their clients, there is this creeping, but I know stuff, but in a way I know better because I've trained this, so I have the experience. And really giving the client the lead, not just in content, but also in process, that still feels like a huge step, even though intellectually coaches say, yes, that's a great idea, and I'm already doing it.
Yeah. I mean, they did some interesting research in the medical field when they asked doctors how much shared decision-making was going on, and the doctors said lots and lots. And then they asked the patients, and the patients had quite a different perspective on how much, shared decision-making there actually was. They felt that there was less collaboration. So we can feel sometimes that, we are being collaborative, but from different perspectives, that's not necessarily the case. And I think it is a challenge to hold that collaborative stance. But really importantly, in pluralism, the emphasis is not on saying to the client, right, the client knows what they need, let them get on with it, let them make all the decisions. It is about dialogue. And coming back to Buber, who writes wonderfully about the kind of interactional nature of dialogue. I mean, it's true, as coaches, you have expertise. And there are approaches in therapy that kind of pluralism has moved a bit away from, where the kind of therapist denies their expertise and says, I don't know anything, it's all up to you. You have expertise, that's enormously valuable. And the challenge is to find a way of interacting that expertise with then the expertise of the client. Because the client might not be expert in, say, coaching methods, or they might not be an expert in how to bring about particular goals or how to set goals. But there are, they are experts in certain areas. They are experts in things like knowing what is ultimately most important to them. And, what is their fun. Like, I just can't, and it's not that I'm going to pretend I don't know. It's that I genuinely don't know. If I work with a client, I genuinely don't know which is their highest order need. Do they want, is relatedness most important in their life, or is it well-being, or is it happiness, or is it meaning? I mean, these are all different things and people vary, and I just can't know. So I do need to genuinely work with the client to collaborate in that way.
Also, how do you best learn? I mean, I can't know how the client best learns. They kind of need to tell me, right?
Yeah. So it's not exactly. So it's not about a kind of faux put on humility, kind of like pretending I'm going to hold this position of I don't know. It's about kind of recognizing, being honest about those things that we genuinely don't know about, and actually being okay about that. Is that, as coaches, therapists, there are things we genuinely don't know, and that's fine.
Yeah. So in essence, the pluralistic approach means that the coach is not responsible for choosing the right intervention, the right homework, or the right process, but that it's a dialogue with the coachee that this is being created. And
I mean, I wouldn't quite put it, they're not responsible. I think, as you say, it's about a dialogue and it's about working out together. So to give you an example, the guy I was working with, I think it was around like 6 years ago or so. So he was looking at, he was projecting, and, we might say he was seeing me as kind of strong and certain, and he was seeing in me a kind of, he was talking about that kind of definiteness that he saw in me, and as a client, because of his own personal process, that was something that he was talking about saying. Now, there was a question for me about, should, in that situation, is it helpful for me to self-disclose? And should I talk about, actually, I have vulnerabilities, and kind of challenge that projection? Or should I hold that projection and actually allow that to be there, and to work with that, and not actually disclose some of the stuff that's going on with myself? Now, I genuinely don't know the answer to that. I genuinely didn't know. I genuinely didn't know what was right and what would be most helpful for that client. And so that was a situation in which actually having that, what we call meta-therapeutic communication or meta-communication with a client, and talking to the client about, well, what do you think? What and a kind of adult to adult conversation. It might be in a situation like that. For instance, a client says, I just don't know. But often clients will have some kind of idea, like they might say something like, well, maybe it'd be useful just for me to explore that projection for, a few sessions, and then we can talk about it, so that, we can draw on and work together. And there's so many examples throughout your work. If you think about throughout the work that you do as a coach, when you come to situations where you're thinking, actually, I'm not sure what to do here, what's helpful. Well, often our first step is to kind of take that away to supervision, and that's often a really useful thing to do. But also,
if you have the luxury of time.
Yeah, if you got the luxury of time. But also, there is the option in that situation, and sometimes it can be very helpful, going back to the person you're working with and saying, what do you think here? And having that conversation, and rather than doing it behind kind of closed doors, doing it with the person and empowering them to be part of the decision. Because that kind of shared decision making is not just about reaching the best kind of outcome and doing it in the most helpful way. It's also about empowering the person you're working with by helping them feel that they are part of that decision-making process. And it's also about building a relationship. When we did research on clients' experiences of shared decision-making, what we found is that actually, in many ways, what it did is it helped them feel trusted, it helped them feel respected, it helped them feel that they were on the same page as the therapist, because they were being involved in some of these decisions rather than these decisions being made kind of behind their backs.
And I think that kind of transparency is, it's quite an elegant way to get out of a big dilemma as a coach, right? Just to acknowledge, it's like, it seems like we can go this way or we can go that way. Like, which way do you think is going to be most helpful for you right now?
Yeah.
And to me, it comes so natural now. And it's amazing to me how many practitioners don't seem to consider that as an option because of some pressure that they need to be the expert. They need to know where to go next and how to do it. Where do you think that's coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something about a fear of not being seen as good enough, or a fear of being seen as kind of not knowing. And that if you say to a coachee, well, what do you think? That I guess the fear is the coachee will see you as, you don't know. But,
Breaks
the reality,
trust.
and it will break. But that's not my experience. I mean, my experience, certainly as a therapist, is that clients respect and appreciate that sometimes you don't. I mean, I think if a therapist, a coach, you were consistently saying, "Look, I don't know, sorry, I don't know." You can understand somebody wanting their money back after a while, but there's lots of things we do know, and we're qualified, and so we can be confident in that. But if we, with all that qualification, with all that knowledge and all that experience, there's still going to be things where we just don't know. And we don't know the answers. And that, being confident and being secure in our position and our work means being able to say at times, what do you think? And, or maybe we've even got an idea. Maybe we can say to a client, well, I think this might be helpful, but, what's your sense and where do you think we should go?
Yeah, and it's usually not a blanket, I don't know. Usually there's a couple of options at least that we could think of how we might tackle this, and we're inviting more options from the client. So, It implies, though, that you share some of these information or options in the beginning. How can we imagine that in practice? If a client comes in with a consultation, chemistry call, initial meeting point, and they ask you, right, so how does this work? Well, what do you tell them?
So what we do in therapy, and we spend some time developing it, is what we call an inventory of preferences, which maybe we can put the link in. And that actually it's on. We've got a number of items. It's a measure with I think 18 items and some open-ended questions. We've got 4 dimensions. So one's around therapist directivity, one's around the kind of the amount of emotional work, one's around working on the past or the future, and one's around how much somebody wants to be challenged or supported. And essentially, as part of that initial assessment, we would invite, or you could do it before the assessment, we would invite the people we're working with to complete that. And then that would indicate whether there are strong preferences there. And if there are, it's not that we kind of use that as a menu and say, right, we're going to go and do that. But we would use that as the basis for a dialogue and say, it looks like you really want a lot of challenge in this work, or you want to be supported. Is that right? And then there'd be a chance to talk about it. What we find is that often when we ask clients and we go through that the people have had the experiences. Often people have had therapy before, even if they haven't. Maybe they've talked to people or they've had coaching, and they might say something like, well, I've seen people before and they were really nice and they were really supportive, but I got to the end and I didn't really feel that I got that much out of it. And so I'd really like somebody to be more challenging this time, or I'd like to really go into my emotions. People do actually, generally, we find, have a pretty good sense of where they want to take things. They often don't have, if you just say to somebody, what do you want from this work, or how do you want this work to be? Then it's such a blank page that it's difficult to answer. But as you were saying, Yannick, if you give people different options, if you scaffold possibilities, like you say, well, look, I can be more directive, less directive, I can sit more forward or give you more space. What would you like? Sometimes people say, well, I really don't mind, it's up to you. And that's fine. We don't push it and we don't kind of overkill it. But if somebody has got a view on it, then that's great. And, it's around where we can adjust. So the question, I guess, for coaches is, where are the points at which you feel quite happy to adjust? Because those are the things that maybe it'd be good to get a kind of view from the coach here. If there's something like you work in a really empathic way and you don't want to start working a more kind of challenging or a more kind of confrontational way, there's no point asking it because it's not something you can do. If you don't offer more cognitive behavioral stuff, there's no point asking about that.
Well, I think there's a point asking, because you can, in marketing speak, qualify leads. If you give that sort of questionnaire, I mean, in conversations, I hope that most coaches would have a conversation such as, hey, have you ever had a coach or a therapist or some sort of helping by talking relationship? What was that like? What worked? What didn't work? Yeah. You get a sense by storytelling of what worked. But that inventory, it's a Cooper-Norcross inventory of preferences, right? So you can look that up. I'll try to put a link in the show notes as well. Pre-consultation questionnaire, really helpful to get a sense for somebody's style. And I think it's helpful to ask the question, are you the kind of client that would like a lot of guidance and the coach to take a lead, even though you're not that kind of coach? Where on that spectrum between completely off hands and completely hands-on, where is your preference of being worked with? Because if they give you an answer that's just not you, you can on that basis maybe not even have that first conversation, but instead refer to a colleague.
You're absolutely right, Yannick. You're absolutely right.
So yeah, that just kind of goes into that direction of a question I had kind of on my mind of what happens when you're not so sure, right? If it's the extreme opposite, like, oh, yes, I want you to give me homework after every session and you tell me exactly how it's done. But there's a lot of gray area. And sometimes I guess it depends on the day of the session of what somebody's preferences is. How do you navigate the gray areas of that?
I mean, I think a lot of it is about setting up a kind of culture of collaboration in the relationship. Mm-hmm. So, it's not that you can use a form like that to identify exactly what's going to work and what you need at each point in the work together. But I think what you can do is by inviting clients to talk about their preferences, by having some conversation, you set a culture where it's something you can come back to, it's something that you're able to talk about at a later point. So that, like with the gray areas you're talking about, you can give clients homework and then, they might feel it's too much or they might feel that they want more. But if you set up that culture of collaboration, then clients may feel more able to come back and tell you and talk about it. And then you can refine it as you go along and you can say, how was that? What was that? It's really difficult. I mean, I'm sure it's true in coaching, but it's certainly in therapy. It can be really difficult for the people we work with to say, I don't like this isn't working. It's a lot easier for people just to kind of leave and go. And so kind of finding mechanisms, finding ways of giving space for people to be able to raise the things that they don't like is so important in the work that we all do. And if we can do that, if we can set things off in a way that invites clients to challenge us, to say what they want, say what they don't want, then it means that further down the line, they may feel more able to do that rather than feeling they got to comply. However democratic, however open we think we are, it's often the case that because of the power relationship, clients can feel that they have to comply and do it the way that we want them to.
Yeah. having had lots of conversations with your coaching colleagues, do you feel that it's easier with coaching clients than with therapy clients? I mean, there's a tendency for therapy clients to present in a much more vulnerable state, where I often get the sense from therapists that they feel they need to take more care of their clients and maybe protect them more. And I would imagine it to be more difficult to relate to somebody who presents like that, in this collaborative partnership, eye level kind of way.
My experience is working with clients, even when they're very vulnerable, is that if you talk to people in humanizing, respectful ways, then people are always open, because I think that people sense if you are engaging with them at that kind of eye-to-eye, human-to-human level. So even if you're working with someone who's very kind of damaged and has had some really difficult stuff, if you're saying something to them like, do you have any sense of what would be most helpful for you here? Do you have any sense of what would be a really good way? What I would do, and maybe something we can go on to talk about, is kind of goals in pluralistic therapy, because I think that does sit really, really nicely with coaching. But you work with a client, talks about where they want the therapy to go, and maybe they said something a bit about they just want to feel better about themselves, and you say something to somebody like, do you have any sense of what would be really helpful? And somebody says no, and you kind of move on, or somebody says, yeah, I think about this. My experience, if I'm honest, is that however damaged or struggling the clients I've been working with, they've always appreciated that kind of collaborative stance, and and it is in a different way, and maybe it's less time, maybe where you're doing coaching, you would spend a bit more time on it. It might be a little bit more technical. You might set things out a bit more. You might set an agenda. But I think if we think about that pluralistic stance and the ethics behind it as about, more than anything, about having a humanizing relationship, then I just think, for me, it just goes across the board. It takes different forms, but it just goes, because it's not about getting a form out saying, right, here's a form, do the form, this means I'm going to do that. That's not the spirit of it. I think the spirit of pluralism, and it goes back to that point about normative pluralism, it's a spirit of how do we engage with people in really kind of respectful, humanizing, genuine ways.
Yeah, and if you relate to someone as a resourceful human being who knows the answers somewhere, has a good sense of what they need, then I think they show up more resourceful, and they can probably generate a lot more of the answers. And that said, though, I wonder what happens if you ask a client, what do they think they need? And they tell you very confidently that they need something that you happen to know is probably going to be counterproductive.
You talk about it. And it's a great question, because that's often missed, I think, when that conversation doesn't happen. It can lead to a lot more problems. So for me, one of the reasons why pluralism emerged was because I was seeing in a lot of students I was working with, when they were working with clients, that often the problems were that what the client wanted to do in therapy was often so different from how the supervisee saw it. So the supervisee, for instance, saw that this is a space where you can come and you can explore and find some answers to your problems. And it wasn't working because the client was waiting for the supervisee to tell them what was going to happen, what they were going to do, and how to fix their problems. And I had that experience myself. When I started off working as a therapist, sometimes you get in about 5-6 sessions in, and clients would say something like, "Okay, I've told you what's going on for me now.
Now tell me what to do."
So saying to someone at the beginning, "How do you think this is going to help you?" And somebody might not say, "Well, I think I'm going to talk about it, and then you're going to tell me what to do." But you can pick up pretty quickly early on if somebody's idea of therapy is that they're going to get advice and be told how to do. And that's fair enough. People have different understanding. I don't criticize clients for having that expectation of what that therapy is, but talking about it and being able to discuss that and reach some agreement about what therapy is going to be. As you said, Yannick, going back to what you were saying earlier, if it's going to proceed, if therapy is the right thing for them, or if coaching is the right thing. But having that agreement, and it might be somebody says, well, I think this is, what I'm hoping for is that you're going to give me advice. And I'm thinking, well, supposing you're working with a client, say you're working with a client And the whole thing is that they're not able to be assertive. They're very compliant. They're always doing what other people tell them to do.
They want the same from you.
Yeah, and then they say, and what I want from you is to tell me what to do. I mean, if somebody was going through a bereavement and their issue wasn't about being compliant, and they said to me, I'd really value your advice, then maybe I think, well, okay, that's fair enough. That might be helpful in those circumstances. I don't think that advice is bad necessarily, but if from what the client's presenting, it looks like that's kind of the core of their issue, then yeah, I talk about that, and I'll probably say something along those lines, gently and kindly. But
could you say those words, or maybe some variations of those words? Because I think it's quite crucial how this is being phrased, so that the client or the patient doesn't get the sense that their empowerment is just being rejected.
Yeah.
So how would that sound out of your mouth?
Okay, are we going to role play this, Janet?
We could, yeah, sure.
Okay, so you be the client.
So I'll say, well, yeah, you go ahead. You take the lead.
All right. So it sounds like what you're looking for in this work together is that you want guidance, you want advice, you want me to tell you and help you to, you want me to tell you like how you should deal with some of these issues. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. I trust your expertise, and I think you probably know what's best for me.
Okay. So, I mean, I can really understand why you'd be saying that, and kind of, understanding this work as a chance to get some advice on that. But I'm also aware that when you were talking earlier, what you were saying is that a lot of your problems is that you tend to do what other people tell you to do. You tend to be quite compliant. It's really hard for you to work out for yourself what's going to be right. And then you end up doing what other people tell you. And then you end up regretting it. And you got to the age of 60 now. And you got to the age of 60 now. And you're thinking, actually, it's about time that I'm going to find my own way here. Yeah. So I guess what I'm thinking is, I mean, we could work together, and then if I, was to tell you what to do, is that maybe gonna just kind of compound the problem?
Yeah, and then I would feel compelled to acknowledge that, there seems to be a pattern in my life, and yeah, you might be onto something here.
Sorry, not 60, Yannick. I'm allowed to joke about that because I'm almost 60 myself, so.
That's fair.
So we talk about it. You might say, well, in this situation, actually, I really need guidance, and I need to learn how to be more assertive. And we're working together. I might think, well, actually, that's fair enough. And then we might try it, and then it might be that we get a few weeks down the line, and actually you're learning some skills, and it is helpful, or it's actually you're not getting much out of it because you're still kind of looking to me. So I guess we would work with it. And so that dialogue doesn't mean just going, right, you're going to be right, and what you say to me is going to be right. But it's also about kind of not dismissing it and not saying, there's a kind of, I mean, Yalom, everybody loves Yalom in the therapy world, Urban Yalom, the great Urban Yalom. He says something like, yeah, you love it. I love him. We all love him. But he says something like, whatever a client says that they want in therapy, what they need is the opposite. And it sounds great, it's clever, but certainly the research in therapy doesn't bear that out. The research in therapy shows that if you accommodate client preferences, and that you work with them, that outcomes tend to be better. You get much better retention. It kind of almost double the retention if you're going with client preferences. So that kind of, you were saying earlier about that kind of position of the therapist knows best. I see. Something I feel very passionately about, and I see this a lot in training, I experienced a lot as a supervisor myself. There's this kind of, what is it? The kind of therapist knows best, a slightly patronizing attitude. There's a kind of pleasure in clients being a bit stupid and a bit, seeing, I guess it's something about being able to see further than them. Clients say one thing, actually they mean something else. Somebody else says something. I don't like it. I don't like it. It's a culture, and it's a culture I could really, I remember when I was training, a kind of culture of It's like this kind of hierarchy. You got the clients at the bottom, and then you got the trainees, and then the trainers, and then the supervisors, and people who write the books, and the ones who do the podcasts. And everybody kind of,
the podcast at the top, obviously, right?
Yeah, the top. But everybody kind of knows more than everyone else, and there's a kind of unconscious, or maybe more conscious pleasure in being a bit smarter than the person at the bottom. And it's just not true. Clients come to me who earn twice as much as me, who probably have higher IQs than me, who've done things in their life that I haven't done. It just, if I put them into that hierarchy as being at the bottom of the hierarchy, it's just not true. It's not where they are.
Well, there's almost an arrogance to it in some ways, right? And in other times, I think, well, he is a practitioner with a ton of experience working with people with very similar challenges that you have. Yeah. And there's something they can probably access that I might not be able to access. Yeah. But I think it's in having the conversation, right? Even if I think I know better, I can just be quite transparent in how we already discussed it, right? It's like, this doesn't quite match my experience of having worked with other different people. Yeah. How do you think you're different than the others, or why do you think this would work for you? Or can I share something with you that might feel a little bit challenging, but you're still engaging the person in a dialogue and you're still agreeing on what would be the best way forward?
Yeah, I think people really appreciate that honesty, and it helps to build up trust. Mm-hmm. And where you have that trust, then people can work well if they feel that you're somebody who's going to be honest with them and, talk to them about stuff. And, part of that honesty is about owning and acknowledging our expertise. There's nothing wrong in having expertise. But it's when it's kind of hidden behind closed doors and when it's secretive rather than...
It's a bit manipulative almost.
It becomes manipulative rather than just transparent. I have this knowledge, I have this expertise. This is my experience working with lots of people. What you're saying surprises me, or it's different from what I'm used to, but, and this is my sense of it, but let's explore this together. So, and I think if you have that adult to adult conversation, which I think, going back to your earlier point, in coaching maybe is more the norm than it is in therapy. There's a lovely model in therapy about what's called the real relationship by somebody called Charlie Gelso. And it's the idea that the relationship has these three levels. So we have the transference, counter-transference level, which might be what the coach or the client projects onto us, which is not kind of real, but is their fantasy, as we might say, of who we are. And that we can work with that by analysing, interpreting it.
So it's real for them, but it's not reality of who you are.
Yeah. But then you also have like the collaborative relationship, the alliance, about us working together. And then what you have is just the real relationship, which is us as two human beings who are vulnerable, real people in the world. And having all three of those relationships kind of well developed is the important bit. And it doesn't mean that, I'll work with clients at that transferential level and talk about, what they might project onto me. But it doesn't mean also that I might not offer them a cup of tea if I'm, if they come into my, where I see a client, or I might, if they ask me where I'm going on holiday, I might just talk very briefly about it. I don't think they exclude each other, and that real relationship, that being real with somebody, doesn't mean you can't say, right, let's sit down and let's get on with the work.
Yeah. And this is where many coaches would say, well, you got to have that professional boundary. Don't self-disclose, when actually that's part of the real relationship. Right, the human-to-human relationship. And there's debatable, context-specific. When is that a good idea to self-disclose or to tell somebody where you were on holiday, and when is it actually going to close the door to the conversation that you really need to have?
I mean, what we see in the therapy research is that a bit of self-disclosure is preferable, or is associated with better outcomes than a kind of what's the word? I was going to say kind of a refusal to disclose. It's like if somebody asks you, where did you go on holiday?
It's like, that's so interesting. Why do you want to know?
Yeah. Well, you can. Yeah, I mean, you can put it back, and you can have that conversation with the client, and that might be really interesting. But sometimes, that kind of like, why do you want to know, and what's that about? And making a bit of a meal out of it is actually counterproductive. And
just making small talk, being nice, Yeah,
a bit of small talk is, I think, is really important. And I think, for somebody coming into a situation like therapy, maybe more so, maybe also with coaching, where they're anxious and they're concerned, feeling that you're meeting a real human being who is able to relate, who has some openness, who cares about you, all those kind of basic human, real relational qualities sets up for the alliance, and then that sets up for also working at different levels. So I think these things can be really helpful. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I think sometimes we can get so kind of caught up in, I mustn't disclose about this. I mean, professional boundaries are really important. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely believe that. But I think they can get a bit fetishized. And when they become fetishized, there's one example from our research on relational depth about close relationships. When a client was seeing a therapist, and the sessions were at the therapist's home, and they'd arranged the session a bit earlier, and the client turns up early, and the therapist is there, and they're not kind of ready for the session because they'd forgotten, and so they say to the client, come and sit in my living room. And, the client wasn't too bothered about these things. They weren't bothered that the therapist wasn't kind of in the, professional readiness and things. But then when the client was sitting there, as the therapist was making themselves breakfast, which again, they weren't particularly bothered, people need breakfast. They weren't particularly bothered by that. But it was that when the therapist was making themselves breakfast, they said to the client something like, as they were making themselves a cup of tea, I don't make tea for clients. And that was the absolute killer for their client. And they never went back because it was just like, why, you make yourself a cup of tea, make somebody else a cup of tea. It just felt a bit inhuman.
Well, I'm already sitting in your living room, so that's where you draw the line? Okay.
I think that's where they had the sessions. I mean,
Oh, right.
But it was just, I think as therapists, we need to be real human beings. I don't think we do anybody any favors by kind of disguising that.
Yes, and this is where I started loving Yalom. When I started reading that, it just seemed so much more human in his approach to therapy.
It's very human.
And I hadn't associated him with do the opposite, right? But that notion of don't give the client what they want, give them what they need, is still quite prevalent in coaching. And
it's clever, there's a cleverness there. It really sounds clever, I know, I don't, not what you want, what you need, but
it can sometimes be spot on, right? But I think the key is if it's a dialogue and if you're transparent about your maybe doubts, whether what you say you want is really what you need right now, you can voice those doubts and then agree together, and that changes everything. Yeah,
absolutely. But I think you need to start with a relationship. I think if that's, it's like if you founded a relationship, if a client feels trusted, you've established trust. If a client feels that you will listen to them, and that you will really take on board their opinion, you can absolutely say to clients, and I have myself said, well, look, you're really asking me, for instance, to give you advice here, and I really don't think, that's what you need. I know that's what you want, but then you say, I know you want reassurance, but actually I don't think that's, I have said those things to clients, but I that's where you start from.
In the context of good rapport, it works.
Yeah, but there has to be that rapport first, and there has to be that trust that you are listening to somebody, and then there's a lot of scope for challenge, and client. One of the things we've seen in our research is that a lot of clients really want challenge, and actually the clients who want challenge do the best in therapy. The ones who do the worst, ironically, seem to be the ones who want warm support. And that's not to say that warm support isn't helpful, but clearly there's a place for more focused challenge. But you need, we know from all our research in the therapy world, you need to establish the alliance. Somebody needs to feel that they're being listened to, their preferences are being listened to, that there's an openness, that the therapist is willing to hear them, and then they can hear that challenge afterwards.
Does that mean that sometimes you have gone with a client, even though you might have felt this is probably not going to work out because the rapport wasn't quite there, and then you just kind of, let's do 1 or 2, 3 loops, and then maybe we can come back?
I don't think so. I can't think of any time when I've done that, actually, because I think I'd be working on establishing, developing that relationship. And I think fairly early on, if I thought something wasn't going to be helpful, I'd probably say, I think it's a good question, actually. I need to think about that one. But my initial sense is that it's not really something somewhere I've gone.
My sense that challenging a client on that is building rapport, because you're being transparent from the beginning, and you're not just kind of going with it. But if you have some doubts, you're not just going to swallow them. You're going to say what you think.
Yeah, I think so. That's the way I would tend to go. But I think, doing it in a warm, friendly way. I mean, something I've learned from the research is that you just can't underestimate the value for most clients, maybe not all clients, but for most clients, of warmth, friendliness, care. That really, people, certainly as a therapist, people are so anxious about being judged. I imagine as a coach as well, people have a lot of concerns that they're going to be judged, they're going to be criticized, they're going to be shamed. As a therapist, often the people that we see are people who have really been damaged in their lives. So just that kind of warmth, I mean, not an artificial warmth, not something inauthentic, but allowing ourselves to express kind of warmth, care, can create a lot of holding security where all these other things then can take place.
Yeah. Hey, Mick, on a practical level, like it sounds like a lot of my clients is quite different work, right? So given that you actively invite this process, how do you keep track of your clients' preferences when you might work with 20 clients with 20 very different preferences? Do you take notes, or do you look at the questionnaire answers before a session, or how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, the questionnaire answers are really useful, and that's something that you can go back to. And then you can also take that to supervision. So that can be really useful in supervision as a way of, reflecting on, okay, there's these options, but then what is it that the client has also said? But I would definitely keep notes, and if clients talk about strong preferences or strong preferences against something, that's something that I would record and again come back to, so that I kind of know and have a feel from each client where it is that they want to go. But I think also, as you work with somebody, if you kind of align with their preferences, then you have a feel each time you're working with them of what it is that you're doing together. And also I would kind of try and have regular reviews and check with somebody at fairly regular intervals how they're feeling about the work, and really invite them to say, is there anything they want different? Is there anything they want to change? So that, that they have a sense of it's still on track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Another question I had was, is there a particular kind of client that is more open to this? Like a recent guest, for example, on the podcast said that she's on her MCC journey, Master Certified Coach with the ICF. And her conclusion recently was that it takes an MCC client to really do an MCC session. And I wonder if something similar might happen in the pluralistic space. Is there a kind of client that this really resonates with, and maybe some clients it's just not for them?
I mean, it's a great question. I don't think so far that we've kind of identified particular groups of clients that would benefit. And I think if you look at the research, there's not clear evidence that there's one kind of group or one characteristic where working with preferences seems to make more of a difference than others. I mean, we know kind of generally about from the research, certain clients tend to do better in therapy and tend to have better outcome. But yeah, I don't think so. Do you have any sense, Yannick, who would be most helpful for?
I think my sense would be the kind of person that is already inclined to latch on to other people, right? We kind of reference as part of the role play somebody who really wants somebody else to take the lead. And if that's really entrenched, quite sedimented, it might be really difficult to work with in coaching, or kind of, even if you invite them in to that way of working, they might say yes, but it might not be available to them.
Yeah. It'd be really interesting to see. I mean, I guess the people who are listening and watching to this, be interesting to think about who kind of inviting into that collaborative relationship is more helpful with, and who maybe seems less inclined. Because part of being pluralistic is being pluralistic about pluralism itself. So it's not about kind of insisting that everybody does a lot of shared decision making. It may be that some of the people that you're working with, it isn't appropriate. So we would kind of offer it, but if somebody doesn't want to engage with it, or just wants a different way of working, then that in itself we would be open to. But it's a really good question. It's something to think about.
Well, it seems really key how this is being introduced, because from the get-go, from even before there's an initial conversation, perhaps, there's some information shared, there's maybe questionnaires shared, getting a sense for it. I guess clients who already know a good deal about coaching or have experienced different forms of coaching and therapy, I would imagine it will work a lot better for them because they already know about different kind of processes. If you've worked with 5 coaches in your life and then you work with a pluralistic one, I think are probably a lot more fruitful.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's certainly going to be particularly meaningful for somebody who has experienced different ways of coaching and has their own kind of views about what works for them or not. I think that's where it's particularly relevant. And I think somebody who's new to coaching may, certainly like somebody who's new to therapy, you ask them their preferences, they may just say, I don't know. And that's fine. I mean, Yannick, what you were saying earlier about asking somebody about previous experiences of coaching, that's one way into asking about preferences is to say, have you had coaching before? Have you had therapy before? What worked for you? What didn't work for you? What did you like? What didn't you like? And if somebody says, no, I haven't, then it may be that, you go on and just say, do you have any thoughts about what would be helpful here? But it's probably going to be a less developed discussion than if somebody says, yeah, I've had three, 4 episodes and I particularly like this, I didn't like that. And these are the kind of things I want.
Yeah, and I love how questionnaires and models can inform what we're being curious about, right? Because we could just let that person tell us what worked well and what didn't work so well. But we could also ask specific questions around, were you focusing on specific goals or was it quite open? Did you get lots of homework, lots of guidance, or were you invited to take the lead? So based on the questionnaire items, and I encourage everybody to go look that inventory up. By the way, pluralisticpractice.com has a bunch of tools and measures that you can download. I found that really helpful. It really gives you a good way, an insight into how that might work. And that article that we mentioned in the beginning, that we're going to share the link to, also gives you I'm not sure if it's a step-by-step process of how a pluralistic coaching session could look like, but it gives you more of a sense in practice how that might work.
I mean, I think the area of pluralism in coaching is still evolving and being developed, and it'd be really interesting to, people listening and watching, maybe to say that way and think about how that would be applied. And that article gives kind of some basic principles, but I'm sure there's a lot more that could be evolved and developed. In the therapy world, I mean, pluralism is a kind of reaction or response to very ideological approaches. So the last thing we want to be doing is kind of flag waving, saying pluralism is great and it's the answer to everything. We should now be a pluralist. But I do, after 20 years, I do still really like it. And I tell you what I like, Yannick, is it's the openness. It's just really open. It allows me as a practitioner, as a therapist or coaches, just to feel that you can move about between different things, that you can enjoy and celebrate the kind of diversity that's in the field, that you can be open to different clients, that you don't have to get wedded to one thing, and that there's a real kind of joy and a real specialness in being able to have that kind of flexibility and fluidity. I mean, you're asking about what clients it suits. Probably there's also what coaches does it suit, what practitioners does it suit, and I think it particularly suits people who are kind of like that openness to experience. Somebody who likes a kind of fixed way of doing stuff, a kind of manualized. He's probably not going to get so much out of pluralism. I think it's for people who, as practitioners, like being open to diversity, like to grow, like to learn, like to think about different options, like to have a critical stance as well, in the sense that they kind of, whatever they're doing, they want to be able to recognize that have strengths as well as weaknesses. It's not going to suit people who like to feel that what they're doing is the right thing and that they're right and have need or have that security of these are the answers. And that's where, pluralism comes out in many ways of existentialism. And existentialism throws up so many questions about the answers. And, as every good existentialist knows, there just aren't these answers. And that's kind of pluralism takes that forward, really, is that if you can sit and you like sitting or you value sitting in that ultimate unknowingness, then pluralism provides a really nice framework for that. If you want answers, then it's probably not the thing.
Yeah. And I know we're an hour in, but I still need to ask this question, right? Because I often called existential coaching fertile ground for integration, right? Integrating bits from, humanistic practice, bits from psychodynamic, bits from here, positive psychology. There's all these methodologies, all these lines of inquiry, these tools, pieces of interventions that we can work with. And pluralism seems to be even more fertile for this. And I remember a talk you gave at the Weekend University where you kind of told the audience about different ways of integrating practices, right? From we have cognitive and we have behavioral therapy, just kind of put them together. But then there's also different other quite intricate ways of putting things together. And so I wanted you to maybe talk to our audience a little bit about how you integrate and why it might be important to think about different ways in which we integrate from pluralistic approaches into our practice.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people use the term integration, but how you actually do it is often quite challenging. Do you do different things in one session? Does it mean using different methods with different clients at different points in time? How do you bring together in a coherent way ideas and practices from different approaches without it becoming what's called syncretism, a kind of just chucking stuff together and hoping it'll work? And in the therapy field, there are different models of integration. There's models like theoretical integration, which is where you take two or more different approaches and create a new model out of them. There's assimilative integration where people start at a basis, maybe say person-centered counselling or existential counselling, and then bring other approaches into that base. You've got common factors models, which is where people would, rather than being based around particular orientations, would say, well, there's common factors that are related to change in therapy as there is coaching, like the relationship, like client factors, like hope, and that the work is based around that. You have eclecticism, which is kind of more disparate. Pluralism is a way of integrating, which, like all forms of integration, has a particular kind of orienting point. And the orienting point in pluralistic integration is around that dialogue that we've been talking about, Yannick, about that dialogue with the client, between the client and the coach, the therapist, about what the coachee, the client, thinks is most likely to help them, what we think is most likely to help them based on our kind of skill set. So it's a kind of flexible, adjusted way of working where we don't necessarily need things we can draw from different models, psychodynamic models, humanistic models, but it all needs to be based around that kind of collaborative understanding. But people use different principles for integration, and that's certainly not the only one. And sometimes it's based more around a particular model of the self. But I think that collaboration, if we see it as being around our expertise and then what the client might see as fitting them, does give that space to draw in lots and lots of different things. And the coherence in it comes from being things that we agree together can be helpful, and that there's a kind of transparency and that there's a kind of rationale for why that might be helpful. So it's not just kind of chucking stuff in, whatever fits. It's things emerging through that dialogue, that being together, that working out together, what we're doing together. And it's an exciting space to be. There was some interesting research that a while back in therapy around burnout. And what it showed is that therapists who work in more integrative ways tend to be less likely to burn out than therapists who just stick to one particular model. And I think the reason for that is, certainly I experienced, and I've experienced it since I moved from a more kind of single modality existential to a more pluralistic approach, is there's something really creative in that practice about being able to draw on different things. It doesn't mean I don't feel like I have to do everything. It's not that I can do 450 different kinds of therapy, but within what I know, I can work relationally with a client to work out what we do together. And that feels a good space to be in. Much better space than me as the expert having to decide or having one model to work from.
Yeah, well, it weighs heavy on practitioners, and I see that in supervision all the time. It's a lot of responsibility, but a lot of that responsibility is taken by the practitioners rather than an actual reality of the work.
Yeah, how do we create a creative, fertile space together in which we can do really good work drawing on both of our sets of expertise? I guess that's a kind of pluralistic question.
Yeah, and it's almost strange that this developed in therapy and then went into coaching when coaching seems to be so much more conducive to that kind of mindset.
Yeah, I know, you're right.
Well, Mick, I thank you for your time. This has been really enjoyable and it flew past very quickly. If people wanted to learn more from you or about pluralistic practice or both, where would you point them to?
Well, definitely the pluralistic practice site. There's also mick-cooper.co.uk, which has got a lot of stuff around different bits of work that I've done. And then do have a look at that paper, and then you're going to put the link there, aren't you, Yannick? So that people can read that. But it's been wonderful talking to you, and thank you for the dialogue, true dialogue.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mick.
Thanks.
To watch these episodes on video, make sure you also check out youtube.com/animascoaching. See you back here soon.